We have been talking about the various career opportunities available to you in the field of photojournalism. We are going to talk to Soumya Khandelwal today as she tells us about the various opportunities available to you both as a freelance photographer and as a full-time photographer. She is also going to talk about how one can get support for one's documentary projects, and you will discover what are residencies and how they can help you develop your capacities as a photographer and photojournalist. What are the various contracts between photographers and their clients or employers, and how does one negotiate a contract? We'll talk about these and also how to keep copyright for your pictures if you want to. Let's go over to Soumya Khandelwal.
I think to start with, it's very important for us to understand that while most of the colleges and universities are preparing photographers, very few photographers who come out really know what are the career options available in front of them. And that's specifically true for photographers who've, let's say, trained in a genre like documentary photography. Because so to say, there are hardly any jobs for documentary photographers. The most you could do is you could work with NGOs and be on board with them either on a full-time basis or on a freelance basis for projects. But as a photographer, it's increasingly becoming to be very volatile and to be working in many genres at the same time. If you train in photojournalism, you can obviously work with publications. So you'll have newspapers, you'll have magazines. Fortunately, now you also have online mediums. For example, a platform like the Print or the Scroll will need photographers for their online stories. So that's a full-time job you can have. Secondly, there are NGOs who like to have photographers on board with them all the time, who would not just document the stories, not just document the events and things that are happening with them on the daily basis, but also send them to document important stories. So for example, a lot of NGOs end up working with photographers because they need to show their work to a larger audience in order for them to get more funding to engage with normal people like you and me. And a photographer typically would also be documenting what happens in their offices and the official stuff in the meetings and everything that's happening, but would also get an opportunity to work on very important stories which are of social significance. So for example, in the case of a friend who's working with an NGO that works with disaster management, he's had the opportunity to go to every place where a disaster has happened in the last 3 years. So he has covered the Kashmir floods, he's gone to Assam for the floods, he's gone to the Kerala floods, and that can be a really big opportunity because as a freelancer there are a lot of risk involved and it might not always be safe, but here's an NGO that's backing you up. So NGOs often turn out to be a sustainable option because they're always there and they always need documentation. On the other hand, they also engage with freelancers. So for a lot of photographers who do not want to get into full-time jobs or who are still struggling with finding jobs, a lot of NGOs will hire them on a per day basis. And if, for example, they'll have work for 5 days, they'll pay them the per day rate and plus pay their expenses. So that's one of the ways where you can work with NGOs. Another sector which is very lucrative is the corporate sector. What corporate sectors usually need are, they would need their conferences to be documented, their events to be documented. They would need portraits of their executive bodies, of their employees, and they can pay better rates than NGOs, which is why it turns out to be a lucrative place. If you talk about other genres, then you have architecture photography, so that's one place, and hotels and restaurants often need documentation. Food photography is a place where you can go. So these are the other options that you have. Then you can obviously assist photographers to start with in order to get into any of these jobs because it just enriches your bandwidth of experience, like how just working with a photographer, and you also get a chance to learn the business of photography. A lot of us, when we get into the industry, kind of understand how to photograph things, but we do not really know how to deal with the business part, how to deal with clients and talk to them. So that is one thing that you really gain at if you're assisting photographers. And one place which I think, thank God it exists, is wedding photography. I think for all documentary photographers who are really struggling to make money, it's a great place to be earning from. And you know, it's like a short term, short period of work, and you end up making more money than you'll probably make from 10 days of work from an NGO. So I know a lot of photographers end up being shy in pursuing this at the first go, but you know, you can make it big, and it can be a very good way to make weddings your commercial source of money, while you invest your personal time in pursuing documentary projects, which is free from control of publications. I think one thing that photographers really need to understand and know very little about when they are starting is contracts. Contracts are basically agreements that a photographer enters into with their clients. So if you're in a full-time job, right before you start your job, your employer will give you a contract to sign, which will basically state the various conditions of employment, along with also the copyright issues. On the other hand, if you're a freelance photographer, you will probably enter into a contract with every major client that you end up working with. And it's very important to understand how to work with these contracts and how to negotiate them at the first place. A lot of contracts can be very regressive, if you may call that so, which primarily means that photographers will not have any copyrights over the photographs that are being taken, and some contracts would not even allow you to use your own work in your portfolio. So I would never enter into a contract like that, and I would highly discourage anyone from entering into any such contract, because at the end of the day, your portfolio it's like your report card, and it's like what you put forward to your client, what you show to your next client to get more work. Which is why even if an employer says that, all right, I will pay you double the rate that you usually charge, but I want all the copyrights of the work, I'll probably agree, but I'll still want the liberty to use those photographs in my own portfolio. That's one thing. The second thing is that there's this concept of shared copyrights, which means that, for example, XYZ employees takes my services for a particular assignment, and whatever work comes out of it gets credited as, let's say, Soumya Khandelwal for the New York Times, which means that both of us share the copyrights, and both of us can further sell those photographs to a third party in exchange for money, and we're not obliged to each other. I think those are great contracts to be working in. The third kind of contract would be where I own all the copyright. The client is basically paying me the royalty to use my photographs. The third kind of contracts would usually happen when, for example, I'm working on a story which is really important to me, but the client cannot pay me enough. So I can tell my client that, all right, you have the royalty to use these photographs for the next 6 months only related to your story, but I will be the one who owns the copyrights, and I can sell those photographs further. So these are the kind of contracts that photographers usually end up working with, and when we are starting, we often take these contracts very lightly, but you'll be surprised that there is always scope for negotiation. And if you negotiate, that's never a premise for the client to say no to hiring you. The client might decline accepting those negotiations, but the client will still hire you, which is why it's always important to put your point out there. I think the kind of work that we're talking about when we talk about work that needs support is mostly documentary projects, because they're longer term projects and there are no takers for it when you're starting, which is why what usually comes as a blessing for documentary photographers are grants. Grants are an excellent place to apply for if you wish to receive funding for the projects that you work in. So typically you would need to log into Google, and you need to Google grants for photographers, and you'll have a list of those grants, and then you need to figure out what are the grants that are more useful to you, because a lot of time grants will be dedicated to certain subjects. So does your theme fall under those subjects? These will be the kind of criteria which you'll need to look at, and depending on the kind of amounts that they give for the grant, you can decide to apply for them. What usually happens is that at the end of the grant, you're required to make a delivery. For example, I started working on the Child Brides project in 2015, but I only received a grant in 2017. For the 2 years while I was investing my own money in 2017, when I received a grant, my deliverables required me to complete the project in the time frame of 1 year and then to deliver it in the form of an exhibition. So, these are the usual terms that people who are taking up grants have to work under. Another place that can be of interest to photographers are residencies. Residencies would typically be a situation where there are these organizations which are willing to have artists come into their studios or to these residencies which they have created. The photographers or the artist usually stay there for varying between a couple of weeks to a couple of months. They require to work on certain projects which either they pitch by their own selves or which the residencies wish them to work around, and then after the delivery is over, which might not always be the case because some residencies would not even need you to deliver, they just want you to come there and engage. You can go back to doing what you were doing. So, residencies are a good way to network, meet new artists, which is very, very important for our field, because one of the very interesting things that are happening right now is that photographers are now, and especially freelance photographers, are now being provided trainings in various other skills. For example, when I was present at the National Geographic Photography Seminar last year, we were also given the option of attending leadership and public speaking trainings, because it is highly acknowledged that as photographers, we are not just shooting, we are also talking about our work, and are we confident enough to talk about it? Or when we are supposed to take up new projects, or when we need to really reach out to a wider audience, are we enterprising enough to be thinking about it in a bigger scale? Are we ambitious enough and skilled enough to be handling the details and the scale of that project? Which is why a photographer is not just a photographer in the modern days, and all of those photographers who are still existing in that box will really have to push themselves out and explore new ways if they want to sustain and be successful in the longer term. Residencies can also be a very interesting way for photographers to explore new avenues for them, because to start with, I think one thing that's very important for photographers to do now is to really network and know what's really happening around them, which is where residencies become important, and a lot of them will be for artists and not for photographers specifically. But they would invite artists to come at this particular place for a time frame varying between a couple of weeks to a couple of months and create a body of work, and a lot of them might eventually result in an exhibition or a book, or sometimes maybe there is no deliverable at all. But what residencies really help you with is to meet new people, exchange ideas and to network. And this is one thing which I think has increasingly become important for photographers. Because we are in an unorganized industry, it is really important for us to know how to go about doing things, how to explore new opportunities, and it only happens when a lot of people are aware of the work that you are doing. Which is why for a photographer who is starting, once they have had a good portfolio, it is important to be, let us say, going to photo editors and to be sharing their work with photo editors, and then maybe meeting curators, meeting senior photographers, because all these people are aware of what's happening in the industry. And whenever people come to them asking them if they have recommendations for younger photographers who can, for example, do a particular assignment, or who is probably doing interesting work and they want to highlight the new work that's coming up, these are the people who further end up recommending your work to the other people.
Soumya Khandelwal advises us to be pragmatic, and she also tells us that if we want to do our documentary projects which come from our passion but which are not getting funding, it's okay to take on other commercial work which gives us our source of income. Therefore, we must remember that what we have learnt in this lesson, that we have to start with first the passion and the interest in the field of photojournalism. Having found our passion in this field, then we can choose to be a freelance photographer or we can work with an organization. But we must remember always to develop and keep developing our portfolio of work so that we can reach out to people and show them our work through various platforms including social media, a website and other forms of communication. We hope that you'll be able to find your path and your journey in photojournalism, and we wish you all the best.